It's now essentially a two-man race for the Democratic nomination for president, with former Vice President Joe Biden currently maintaining a delegate lead over Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders in the primaries. The winner, of course, will face President Donald Trump in November. During the election cycle, political pundits are constantly analyzing voters of all age groups and demographics, including the so-called millennial vote. But what issues are on the minds of these young voters? Carolee McGrath sat down with the president of the UMass Republicans and the president of UMass Democrats to hear what concerns them the most.
I think going forward right now, I think Joe Biden's probably going to be the nominee, given his performance last night in Michigan, and some of the states coming up like Florida, but also his dominance on Super Tuesday.
Yes, because he totally, as some people had described, resurrected himself, really, and became a player once again. What do you think it is about Biden as opposed to Bernie Sanders that is now moving him forward?
I think Biden has the widest coalition, it looks like, at this point. You know, he has a lot of support from the African-American community, older voters, rural voters, and I think he's definitely made a lot of a broader coalition. You've seen Sanders really stay at his 30% base with a lot of Latino voters and younger voters. And Biden has really coalesced basically everybody else in the party. So I think that's really driven him forward.
So, Chad, I think a lot of Republicans, whether they say this out loud or not, were hoping, that Bernie Sanders would be the nominee, somebody easier to beat, contrasting capitalism versus socialism. What do you think?
Definitely. There's certainly that perspective out there, but I actually think that Bernie Sanders would have been a much harder candidate for President Trump to beat. Specifically, I think that while they're polar opposites on a lot of issues, particularly a lot of working class people sort of identify with Bernie Sanders and his policies in a similar way that they do with President Trump's sort of working class philosophy.
Okay, so a YouGov poll came out in November that showed 70% of millennials say they would vote for a socialist. How do you feel first of all, about that?
Like, truthfully, it's pretty scary to me. And honestly, I think that a lot of it has to do with sort of a misunderstanding of capitalism and capitalism as an economic philosophy. And I think that people think of capitalism really as sort of the economic policy of greed and wealth and hoarding money. But I think when it comes down to it, the capitalism is really the sort of policy of benevolency and actually investing. If you look at the richest people in the world, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, even Elon Musk, those people have their wealth and keep their wealth because they choose to reinvest it back into their companies, their communities, their other investments.
And how do you feel about socialism as far as it relates to the Democratic Party? Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist. Why is that so attractive to so many young people?
So I think as the party, I think we're still a capitalist society, but I think a lot of young people have a different view of both capitalism and socialism, that, they've grown up in the time since the Great Recession, and they've really seen, some of the faults of capitalism and, people not having access to whether it be affordable higher education or healthcare. And, they see some of these societies like, Norway and Sweden that have, kind of these mixed economies that are still these capitalist societies, but have a larger social safety net. So I think they kind of view that as socialism, and they don't necessarily have, kind of what older generations have seen, like the Red Scare, and didn't grow up with, the threat of the Soviet Union. I think that's kind of changed how people view it.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of people will say there's no look back. But if you look right now at Venezuela today, a good example of what socialism would look like, you're saying that the millennials kind of have this softer view of more of a mixed sort of system that would have some socialist principles as well. Is that realistic, unrealistic, idealistic?
I think it would be tough in the United States, just given, both our, just the size of the country, and, some of the cultural attitudes. I don't think necessarily that, like, say, a universal basic income, well, a lot of people might like it in theory. I don't think it would ever pass, just given our system, and just the complete polarization in Congress about, passing things, even Obamacare that was, based off of Mitt Romney's proposal here in Massachusetts. It cost the Democrats thousands of seats in, Congress and also on state legislators. So I don't think that, we'd have a big system like that unless, you had what Bernie Sanders has been calling for, a political revolution, but that really hasn't materialized
And
yet.
when you talk to your friends, especially those in your group, do they identify more with a Biden or more with a Bernie Sanders? I know there's other political groups on campus as well, and you're not the furthest to the left on campus. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so how would your friends, where do they stand?
I think there's definitely a mix on campus. You do have people who are more the Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialists, and you have people like, more like a Warren who calls herself a capitalist outright, but then called for more, economic protections. And then, I would say there are more people that are of the Warren area, but, there are definitely people, including myself in the club, that are, more Biden, Klobuchar area.
And middle of the road. And Chad, what do you think resonates with people that you know? What are the things that people care about? I know that Tim had mentioned healthcare and education. Are those sort of the biggest things that millennials are worried about?
Definitely. I think certainly the economy, healthcare, education are all, big concepts that all of us have interest in figuring out solutions to. I think the big difference between sort of a Republican perspective and a Democrat perspective on those issues is really, what sort of role government should play in those scenarios. Is there more limited government? Should it be more private sector intervention in the various areas of issues? And I think for most kids in the club, we like to see more limited government and more of the private sector taking a stance than sort of government intervention in issues.
When you would talk about the club at UMass, so here we are in a blue state, right?
Right.
You're the Republican club in a blue state on a college campus. It can't be easy to make the case, especially if you're talking about those principles, or if you say, hey, I support Trump. How are you received on campus?
It's definitely very tough, and we definitely get a lot of criticism, which, we welcome criticism, and we love, having open conversations about our policy perspectives. I feel it becomes a little bit more dangerous when people start feeling hateful about your ideas, and I think that's a problem that we all really have to overcome as a society.
And how do you both sit next to each other and work with each other on campus as well? Because you see how bitter it has become, in the media between politicians and even voters. When you talk to different voters about whether it's Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, it's just this bitterness that seems to emerge. How do we move forward as we approach this election in a different way?
I think most people we have to recognize the humanity in everybody, that, whether you go home at the end of the day and, you're a Republican or a Democrat, at least like on campus, we have to work together. We go to class together. We see each other at meetings. So, I think recognizing the humanity of people is really important. And just, when you have to work together, you have to put aside some of these differences to make sure that things can get done.
And just because you're getting along doesn't mean you're selling out. I think sometimes people feel like, oh my gosh, if I act nice to this person, it's going to look like I've just lost all of my, my principles. How do you respond?
Absolutely, and I think it's important to maintain sort of your stance on your issues and not sort of give in on those issues. But I think, as political science majors, a major part about politics is just finding compromise, finding the happy medium, and it's tolerance and civility in the workplace and finding solutions to issues.